Welcome to day 77. We are starting the historical books today. So we have finished up the books of Moses, the Torah, the books of instruction, or some people call it the books of law. We will start with Joshua today, which is the first of the historical books in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. We will be reading chapters 1 and 2. We will have Psalm 37 and 1 Corinthians 3. So the historical books are where we enter the promised land, and the Israelites have their own land again. We're going to be looking at the time of entry into the promised land, and then there'll be the time of the judges who were leaders who the Israelites didn't have kings at this time. So the judges were the people who were set aside to help settle disputes and lead the people. And eventually, this will take us up to the time of the kings and the prophets. So basically, we're looking at the time between Moses and King Saul, and King David and King Solomon. Now, one thing to think about as we enter into this section, especially with Joshua, there's going to be a whole bunch of holy war, depending on your translation, like the Message calls it the Holy Curse, where there's going to be battles, and then there's going to be a description of everyone being killed. Now, there are two things to consider here. One is that most likely they are not speaking literally. Throughout this time period, the literature that we have from multiple cultures at this time had this type of literary device of talking about the winners and victors in a battle killing absolutely everyone, all the men, women, and children of the losers. And this did not happen generally. Many times the people who lost were taken as slaves or servants. They were taken to continue working the fields that they were currently working, because many times this was an invading army and they didn't have anyone in the area to be able to work the land. So generally, not everyone is killed. So think of this more as literature than a literal historical description. The other thing is that God really had a major problem with the people who were living in this area of Canaan, what we today call Israel. There was a lot of religious practices that God did not like. Predominantly, there were two main things that really bothered God. One was child sacrifice, and one was temple prostitution. And both of these God felt was undermining the value of life and the holiness of our relationships that God has given us. It's also something that it is really easy to prey on the most vulnerable members of a community, the virgins and the infants. And people could use this form of religious practice as a way to manipulate their gods. And so God really didn't like the whole way that it was used and what it meant and what it did to the people involved with it. So God did want to banish, undermine the people and the cultures that were living in this area, because they were doing things that did not adhere to God's plan for creation. The main themes as we're going through here, especially that you're going to see with Joshua, is the idea of staying connected to God, that God comes first in our life, and that our commitments and our obedience to God are the driving force of our life and our life together as a community. One of the early messages in the first chapter is about how Joshua tells the people to keep reading the books of Moses, that they are to meditate on them day and night, that they are to know and to ponder and reflect on the message that God had given them for life together. Then we start getting into the details of how the Israelites move into the promised land. And the first thing they do is they send some spies out to check out Jericho. Jericho is one of the oldest cities known to humankind in the archaeological record. And the reason it was so old was because it was in a great location. It had fresh water source, and it was on one of the few roadways, pathways that could get you across the Jordan River, along the trade routes along the Mediterranean Sea there. So this is a very important place for the Israelites to take on first. Joshua sends some spies out to figure things out. They meet Rahab, who shelters them because the people of the land had heard about God's power and the power of the Israelites, and they knew they were coming to take over the land. And the people were scared and were trying to protect themselves. Rahab protects them and asks for protection in return. And they do promise that when the Israelites take over Jericho, Rahab and her family will be protected. And when this does happen in tomorrow's reading, Rahab is protected. Now, just a quick note, it's not in here, obviously, but if you go to the New Testament, if you go to Matthew and Luke, where there are ancestry lists of the ancestors of Jesus, you will see that Rahab is a great, great, great grandmother of Jesus. Looking at Psalm 37, this is one of the wisdom psalms. And so it's full of tidbits of wisdom for living life, very much like the Proverbs. It was probably written by the same person or the same group of people that wrote Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. There's some beautiful contrast in here between the people who live righteous and holy lives versus the people who live wicked. But it's also very realistic, and it points out that sometimes the wicked have a pretty good life, but that their goodness, their prosperity, blessings will be short lived. And eventually, God's divine judgment will come upon all of us, and we'll get what's coming to us based on the choices we have made in our lives. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, Paul is scolding the people of Corinth, the people of the church in Corinth that he helped get started. He accuses them of being childish, that they are competing and comparing each other. And this is one of many places in the New Testament where Paul is writing to encourage people to grow to spiritual maturity, to stop acting like babies and children, and to grow to spiritual maturity. Now, to be honest, there's a lot of competing and comparing that still goes on today. And there's a lot of people that feel like they don't know anything, that they rely on their pastor to know lots of stuff, that you can only be a great Christian if you really know the Bible and you're a great theologian. This is not what Paul's talking about here. Being spiritually mature means that you know God, you are living with God on a daily basis. And I mean, one way of explaining this is when you think of what is an adult physically and mentally and emotionally, an adult is someone who can take care of themselves, but they are also capable at the same time of being able to care for other people. Now, it's not that you're the biggest financial whiz and that you have the best job or the biggest house. It's just that you can take care of yourself and you can take care of someone else. You can raise a child, you can be a caregiver to someone who lives with a disability or someone who's aging. So I would like to encourage you to have a little more confidence in your own faith and your own spiritual development, and maybe think more highly of yourself instead of putting yourself down and comparing yourself to other people frequently. God's plan here is that we each have special gifts and talents, and each of us has something important to do. Maybe we're planting seeds, maybe we're watering the seeds, maybe we're laying the bricks for a building, maybe we're building or writing the blueprints. God's plan is complex. It's going to take many generations to happen, but each of us have one small piece to play. And we are not to compare our piece to someone else's piece. We each get to do what God has tasked us to do. Each of us is needed and each of us is valuable. Think of us as a sports team. Each person on the team has a different role to play, but the team is in trouble if they're missing any of the individual people. So all of us are part of God's plan, and we each have work to do to bring God's kingdom of justice and mercy to fruition here on earth. So have a little more confidence in who you are as a child of God and grow into the spiritual maturity of being a grown-up child of God, where you are helping others grow as you continue to serve God and your neighbor. We'll see you next time.